When the budget comes out, people will, tweet, what about the middle class? None of us are middle class. Absolutely nobody listening to this podcast is anywhere near middle class. I feel like the locus of responsibility should not be on the consumer of news. It should be on the producers of news.
As someone who is a data journalist or just interested in understanding deeper insight and trends about the country, where all can we go to and how much can we trust those sources? Do a lot of politicians also consume data voraciously?
They do. And the deployment of data and, mining this data for political strategy absolutely happens. I think it happens in several positive ways. I do feel the public understanding that should come as a result of this data has not happened. So the idea of Data for India is that it is a public platform that aims to expand and enhance this public understanding of key socio-economic issues in India.
Hi, Rukmini. Welcome to Sparks.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was, in preparation for this episode, I was going through your book and some of your other work, including Data for India. And somewhere I realized that you must really love data to kind of have chosen this as your career. You've been doing data journalism a while back and done so much more around data. So is that something that you felt kind of naturally gravitating towards? And how did this whole data become such a big part of your life and profession?
So I do really love it, but I took the scenic route to get here.
Those are always the best. Scenic routes are better.
It didn't seem so at the time. It looked like I was taking really long, but I think I got there ultimately. And then you realize that all of the experiences you gathered along the way ended up being so helpful. So I have no background in math, stats, economics, anything of any use. And I like to say this upfront because it's also a way of encouraging other people who don't have backgrounds in these issues not to necessarily sit it out. I mean, these are always things that now can be learned through a variety of resources. So I started my career as a newsroom journalist in Mumbai, whose job was to run around the city and sometimes, spend hours in a police station. Or
What kind of beat were you covering there?
So I started off with education, then I was covering state government. But as happens with the youngest people in any profession, you have to do a bit of everything. And usually the things other people don't want to do. And I'm sure I complained about it a lot at the time. But what it meant was then I had this rich experience of police stations and courtrooms and government offices and slums and high rises and, all of the mix of it. And I think in a way it shows you how democracy operates on the ground, how the country really operates on the ground. So that all these years later, when I came to data, they don't look like numbers in a spreadsheet. I can picture the lives that, exist behind those numbers. And I can also picture the uncertainties that lie in that data. So it doesn't look like such a surety. Numbers sometimes have this veneer of science. But having seen how things operate on the ground in a police station, for example, the numbers no longer give you that veneer of certainty. So I was a newsroom reporter. Then I decided to do a master's because I wanted to use more research in what I was writing about. And it just sort of organically coincided with the rise of what was then the beginnings of data journalism in India. So took the scenic route and now very firmly here.
No, amazing. As somewhere along the way, you decided to write your book. It's called Whole, I keep mixing the two parts, Whole Number and Half Truth. Sometimes it feels to be, I wish we have access to whole truth. But unfortunately, truth is, it's probably not whole all the time. But what was the rationale behind this title, first of all? I mean, it's very catchy and probably also does justice to, I think, what you're trying to cover. But when you were thinking about title for this, how do you settle on this?
Yeah, you always hope that you're going to come up with that one name, like when you're naming your kids, and that's going to be the first and best one. That actually did happen with the book. It's the only title I thought of, and luckily it went down well with my agent and my editors. It sort of captured what I was trying to say, which is that there's a lot that numbers tell you, and I'm passionate about what can be done with numbers, but it can't capture in everything, and it very much cannot capture everything in India.
And just staying with the title for a second, whole number kind of implies that, there is a lot that numbers can tell us, or a lot of data is available that we can learn from. And half truth kind of implies that truth is probably, there are many truths, and there is an element of subjectivity. It's also depend on where you are in the political spectrum or income spectrum and so on. Is that somewhat you're also implying that, getting to the truth is not that easy while data may be readily available?
Yes, very much so. And, I think that sometimes it can seem as if numbers are telling you the whole story. So it becomes important to start with that element of humility that, that the numbers not necessarily, you can feel like you're being confronted with science and this is the ultimate truth. But to leave that space to know that it's not capturing everything. And I think one sort of very strong example of that is when it comes to police statistics, right? What police statistics capture are what comes from FIRs that are registered across the country. And when we see those numbers, they are used as proxy or shorthand for crime. So crime is higher in this state or that state, or women are now more unsafe or less unsafe. You take that leap from the number to the statement of a bald truth. And I think that's very problematic as a concept in general, but when it comes to police statistics and having seen what happens in police stations, all of us, I think, we should be, much more skeptical. It's not just a thought that we should be more skeptical, but something I have found through research too, which is that when you go beyond police statistics and look at something a little bit more, like even just court cases, you realize that the numbers are not often what they say. So in the case of violence against women, one of the things that I realized, for example, is that in a lot of cases, these were consenting relationships between young adults that parents had decided to oppose, sometimes because they were intercaste or interreligious relationships, and they were calling it assault. But in the eyes of the crime statistics and police statistics, these were going down as assaults, while essentially it was the exercise of agency by young people and the conflict that it put them in with their parents. Very, very different from what it was being used as proxy or shorthand for.
And how does somebody who is a consumer of this data and headlines through news reports develop a better understanding, other than reading your book, of course, is because these kind of headlines tend to be very eye catchy. 50% rise in crime against so and so in the city and state, and then everyone repeat it. But as a consumer of that information and their insight, what should an ordinary citizen do to develop a more nuanced understanding of how to read this data?
Yeah, this is something that I've realized worries a lot of people. Sometimes it worries people when they think about their parents or other, consumers of news who aren't putting in that much skepticism. So first of all, I want to say that I feel like the locus of responsibility should not be on the consumer of news. It should be on the producers of news. And it's the responsibility of those communicating the news not just to be accurate, but also to be much more clear and transparent about methodology, to not give this veneer of certainty about things they don't know about, and to try and explain how numbers are produced much better. That's one of the things I'm very passionate about, which is to talk about methodology. As boring as it sounds, when people actually understand how numbers are collected, they are much more able to understand it and make sense of it. So first of all, I feel like the locus of responsibility is on the communicators. But additionally, there is work that we're all going to have to do. So being able to just passively consume news is a recipe for disaster now. So I think the minimum what we can do is draw a bar of quality and decide that news that doesn't pass that bar is news that we're not going to give our money to or our time to. So if methodology is not explained, if who has funded that survey is not given, if the sample size is not given, maybe we should just, as news consumers, draw a bar and say this is just, it's like the food regulatory authority. Some things don't meet the bar, you don't consume them. Similarly for news, even if, I'm not arguing for regulation, but I am arguing for consumers to draw a bar and say, if I can't clearly see how these numbers were produced, maybe I'm not going to give this newspaper my money anymore.
And is that transparency easy to find? Let's say I see a eye-catching data, some headline about 100% increase in something. Usually a good journalist will quote their source, or at least in subtext somewhere. And as long as sources from a reputed organization, probably even just go look up the link. Usually there are very detailed reports behind, at least credible surveys. And sometimes they are very sketchy, where you talk to 50 people, or at a party talk to 5 people, and then post that as some kind of stat.
Yeah, so if the journalist does want to make the effort, and there again, even journalists have to set this bar. They have to tell themselves that if there is a survey as exciting as it sounds and as, exciting a headline as it might give me, if I can see that it's not coming from a good study, then I really need to pass on this rather than, find some way of communicating it. I think a bunch of Indian organizations and Indian newspapers now that have dedicated data journalism teams do a good job of communicating this. So, it's really our choice then to choose to read this better stuff. And I think at one point, especially when I was in newsrooms, there was a space constraint. So there was often the argument that, we can't spend hundreds of words explaining the methodology. Now there's no space constraint anymore. Everything has a link attached to it. So in fact, it's incumbent on people to be linking to sources. And then for news readers to decide not to maybe consume news that doesn't have, the study linked to it at least.
I do see one big challenge for journalists though, for example, in the headline, you can only quote one number and something, I have learned in business, averages almost never tell the story. In fact, I like to keep saying, don't look at average, look at the distribution, because what's happening at top 10 percentile versus bottom, 10 percentile. And I think you do cover a lot of that nuance in your book. But as journalists filing a small story, it's so difficult to pay attention to distribution. And, you're required to go to a headline number, which may miss out on a lot of the color.
Yeah, that's true. And I think sometimes there are assumptions about readers that they're not going to get this or they're going to find it boring. But just one example, there's a journalist at the Financial Times whose name is John Burns Murdoch, who became, sort of shot to fame, particularly during the pandemic, because data journalism during the pandemic, I mean, he's very good, but he became better known then. And he recently, maybe a few months ago, posted about how the first time he used a log scale in an FT chart, he was flooded with angry comments by people saying, you're lying, what are you doing with the numbers? This is jugglery, you're lying with it. And over time, they were able to communicate why this was a good thing to use. And particularly when it comes to something that grows exponentially, like COVID cases were at the time, the log scale becomes really important to use. So I think what he was able to do was actually shift the needle. He was able to educate maybe the British public about a statistical concept. So saying that readers don't understand something today, and so I'll never talk about it and, they're too dumb to ever get it, is a very condescending assumption about readers, and perhaps they can grow with you. Maybe 2 years down the line, we'll all know what log scales are in Indian newsrooms as well.
Yeah, and I think a great example of that, I think this book, Factfulness, and I think what is their website called also? I think...
Gapminder? Is it Hans Rosling's Gap?
Yeah, Hans Rosling.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they've raised the bar on data visualization. It doesn't matter. We may or may not be very comfortable with numbers, but we're all very good with pictures. And they have these outstanding visual charts, which even very complex phenomena is presented in a very visually easy to understand manner.
And what I love the most there is that the idea is not just to dazzle you with the visualization and that's the main part. So behind that, there are pages of footnotes, there's months of work. And I think one of the things that made Hans Rosling the beloved person that he is in this world is just his passion for it as well. So there was there were these visualizations, there was the work behind it, but someone who genuinely believes in the power of data to change the world, it really shone through in how Hans Rosling presented numbers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So just going to your book for some time. So, each of your chapter in the book, pretty much it's reads like a explainer of India, how much do Indians make, or how India spends its money, or how India works, right? How India lives and where. So this must have been quite a eye-opening and fulfilling experience for you. And I'm guessing you must have learned a lot of interesting insights about, what the country is. So let me just talk about your experience of writing it and also the work that went behind. I know at one level you consume a lot of data, but also you also compiled a lot of stories. And the whole book is written with, lots of stories. Sometimes people call those anecdata. Yeah. And then there is, of course, very comprehensive data also you're juxtaposed with those stories. So what is the whole experience like?
Yeah, no, you've really got at the heart of it, which is by the combination of experiences that I had as a field reporter and as a data journalist, in a way is what you would call qualitative and quantitative. And I don't think I thought of it that way. But what the book was an attempt to bring these two parts of my work together and use them to both fill in the gaps in each other as well as to complicate each other, to not allow one side to be seen as the ultimate truth. In newsrooms, often there's a sort of, conflict between, like in political reporting, political reporters will say, I went to the constituency, I spoke to people on the ground, I know the real thing, you people rely on, opinion polling. So there's sometimes this conflict. But the idea was to bring them together, to mix them, not to say that one completes the other, but maybe one also complicates the other. And I think personally, though, I have made this shift towards data even more so in the last few years. I love talking to people. It was always the favorite, my favorite part of the job. And I remember at one point I was in Bihar covering some elections, and I texted a friend saying that some days my job feels like being paid to understand the country. That's exactly what journalism can be. And on the good days when I wasn't, tired, overworked, or complaining about my salary, it did feel like that's what I was getting to do. And the book is trying to do that. It's pulling these experiences together to try and give you a sense of how things work in modern India, the sort of state of play on 10 important questions. And again, putting it together in some ways was a humbling experience, because I would frequently tell my editor, but I've already said this, well, should I really put it in a book? And there then was the realization that journalism is ephemeral. It comes and it goes. It's not maybe incentivized to create long-lasting knowledge or public goods. And which is why you do need public goods. So although I felt that many of these things had already been said, pulling them together was very valuable. And pulling them together also allowed me to take a fresh look at some data points that surprised me as well. And it allowed me to go back to some of the wonderful people that I had met on the ground over the years, because that's really been, the favorite part of my job. So I have a chapter about marriage, about love and marriage, for example. And there's a whole lot of data that I look at over there, which has to do with data on food, data on religious practices, data on marriage. Mm-hmm. And I talk to a young man in an intercaste relationship at the beginning of the book, beginning of the chapter. And then I go back to him at the end of the chapter and I confront him with the numbers in a way. And I asked him if the numbers made him feel lonely, because the numbers show that intercaste marriage is extremely rare in India, still in the single digits. Mm-hmm. And he said, no, because your numbers are on intercaste marriage. They are not on intercaste relationships. And in the world around him, he said that he had seen many people in intercaste relationships. Now, demographics is not interested in intercaste. Demographics is interested in birth and marriage and childbirth and death. Yeah. But life is lived in between. And so in some ways, what speaking to him did was mess up my entire chapter. Here is a whole chapter that I've built using data, telling you to say that things have not changed. This is how things are. Maybe they are changing at the margins. Maybe they don't reflect in data on marriage yet. Maybe if a big survey, and this would really be my dream survey, if someone went out and asked people about relationships, we don't have data on relations. We get it from, Hinge or Bumble, and those are not great sources of data about the country on the whole. Maybe if someone asked, we would learn a lot more. Maybe there is, radical changes happening on the margins, but they don't get captured in the National Family Health Survey, which is only interested in data on marriage.
Fair. And how extensive was your field work? Just give a sense of, where all did you travel, who all did you talk to, and how complicated your whole book is filled with stories of pretty much all walks of life.
So I think that was really one of the greatest privileges of my time in a newsroom, which is that I was entrusted with enough responsibility that I got sent all over the country. Typically, this would be around elections. There's often a lot of traveling you can do then. But then it extended to other areas of interest as well. So I was interested in women's representation in politics, for example. So I got to, at the time, go and write about the Nagaland elections that were going on, because there were 2 women contesting. Of course, since then there have been successful candidates. But I often also reported on panchayat elections, which I found very interesting. A lot of the time, journalism is responding to horrible things happening. So a lot of my travel would have to do with, disasters. But then you get to talk to people about other things on the sidelines of it. And some of these experiences came as a result of not the direct reporting assignment either. So I have a story in the book as well, which, for me illustrates that people are complicated and hold complicated thoughts. So there's a journalist who accompanied me while I was out doing some reporting. And the person that we were reporting on was from an Adivasi family, and this man refused to drink water from his house, the journalist who accompanied me. And he told me quite clearly later that he would not drink water from this man's house. But then simultaneously, he wanted me to come home to his house to meet his daughter, because he wanted his daughter to see, here's a young woman traveling alone in such a, I was an MP at the time. None of this excuses, biases. This is not a story to say, so untouchability is okay because you may also be a feminist. But some of these insights into people and how their minds work came just on the sidelines, not even as part of the reporting itself. And it's such a cliche, but the bottom line of all of my reporting experiences was that the hospitality of people is extremely moving. I mean, the feasts that I have been fed in, not just in very poor households, but in households that are dealing with tragedy, in households where you are having to arrive like a vulture and ask the most difficult questions. But the kindness with which you are treated, no matter where you go, is
this
such
also
a cliche.
somewhat proportional? The farther you get away from big cities, hospitality keeps increasing, or universal?
I have never met an inhospitable person on a reporting trip. Often it was because, I was alone, I was a young woman. But no, just universally, fed extremely sweet tea at a bare minimum, no matter where I went. Yeah.
And what was the quality of data that you had access to? And also, maybe let's talk about where does the data come from? Because a lot of time, we just consume data fairly quickly, but there's a whole organizations in the country dedicated to that. Just what's what's the overall quality of it, or even how did it all emerge? As someone who is a data journalist or just interested in understanding deeper insight and trends about the country, where all can we go to, and how much can we trust those sources?
Yeah, this has been a really valuable thing to learn. Because I don't think I myself was aware of either the pedigree of Indian data or of its quality. And it's been important to understand this so that I'm not telling people, trust what I'm saying because I'm saying so, or trust the data because I'm saying so, or it came from the government, but trust it, or at least approach it with interest because of these reasons that make it good. So, statistics in India is very closely tied to the spirit of independence, to the spirit of the country that was imagined at the time of independence. And just as planning and development were to be India's way out, statistics was very key to that. So I think there is an element of nationalism really to the Indian statistical system, where this was going to be something that was going to deliver development and was meant to be the pride of the country, and meant to be something that India would show to the world with pride. I think that's a lot of the reason why the system is so good, the Indian statistics.
And what is the system? Most people may not be familiar with. So can you just describe the whole system?
Sure. So the bedrock of Indian statistics is the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, MOSPI as we call it for short. And two key organizations under it, which is the Central Statistical Organization and the National Sample Survey. They are all under now the National Statistical Office. Surveys that the NSO conducts canvass over 1 million people. They are the largest household sample surveys in the world. And it's not just now. When the National Sample Survey started conducting these surveys, this was the first large-scale household survey anywhere in the world. People from across the developing world came to see this, and not just the developing world. Nowhere in the developed world had these surveys been done at this scale. And there was also a really fascinating vibe of sort of innovation then, because this was new. Ultimately, if now we're so used to sample surveys, but imagine selling it back then, which is...
how back then was it?
This was the 30s at a minimum, and then in the lead up to independence. So, Mahalanobis, P.C. Mahalanobis, who then became India's first chief statistician, and his work at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, part of their role was to try and convince the powers that be that sample surveys can do as good a job as counting every single person, but quicker and for less money. And one of the things they did in the Bengal presidency at the time, for example, was to make this argument that sample surveys could be good. Field surveyors from the agriculture department went out into the fields and estimated plot by plot yield of some crop. I think it was either jute or rice, which is what they used to always do. Like you go plot by plot and you estimate what the yield is going to be. And then, these young ISI statisticians did a sample survey of the same thing, trying to estimate what the yield would be. And what ended up happening was that the sample survey was closer to being, what the actual number was in the end. So it made a great case on the ground for why sample surveys, were good. And this is a story recounted in Nikhil Menon's book, Planning Democracy, for example.
Yeah, maybe I'll just, for a second, I'll just take a segment, just tangent and go into 101 mode. And I know you also teach and mentor our younger people. Can you just explain very simply, like, what does a sample survey mean? Some folks may not understand, because when we say that 30% of people have this thing, we may think we are counting literally everyone.
Yeah.
What is the extent and when does these surveys become statistically significant?
Yeah, no, happy to do that because so much of what we know about the country does come from sample surveys. And the idea is just that it's not always possible to count every person. So you speak to a group of people and they become representative of the
How many? Few hundred, few thousand?
So the key part is not really the number. The key part is making sure that sample is representative of the universe that it's talking about. So sometimes people, hone in on that number and get very outraged about it. You've done a survey of 1,000 people. How are you talking about a country of 1 billion? Sure, maybe your sample should be a little bigger than that. But what's much more important is, did you ensure that the sample is representative on gender terms, on caste terms, income terms, language terms? Or did you just find the, first 1,000 people you could find online? And if you do that, what that means is that sample is more likely to be male, more likely to be younger, more likely to be urban. If you did do that, did you correct to make sure that it accurately represented the country? So I, in fact, am more bothered by these large online surveys that don't sample properly. They may have a very big sample size because how hard is it to, click a survey online and then produce results that are not, it's not clearly communicated that these are not generalizable. We know of sample surveys largely during elections, right? Because that's what opinion polling is. But the Indian government has been in the business of doing these sample surveys for 70 plus years now and doing all in all a pretty good job of it. And again, it's not me saying they're doing a good job. It is because when you triangulate it with other data, you find that it's largely a good job. Of course, there are grounds to do better. And there is international oversight. So it's not just us tinkering away over here. The eyes of the world are on India's surveys. There's a lot of publishing that happens around data produced in India. So even if there are issues, which there often are, it will be debated to death in the pages of international journals, newspapers, etc. So there's a very vibrant discussion around these. So India produces both the National Sample Surveys and the National Family Health Survey, which are really the two big sources that we, base all of it.
What is the frequency of these surveys?
So the National Sample Survey, some of the topics in it have their own fixed frequency. For example, we used to conduct a consumption expenditure survey every 5 years. That was its frequency. Now it's going to be more frequent. Then there is the periodic labor force survey, which comes under this, which is now every quarter. So it depends on the topic that's being surveyed. The National Family Health Survey, again, used to be done every 5 years, but again, the periodicity is improving now. And most of these have now moved to tablet-based. They aren't long pages. So that's allowing them to be done a little faster as well.
And how do we process this? I think last year there was a big headline that India is now more populous than China. I think something like 144 or 145 crore people. But we haven't had a consensus in 2011. So how do we know and why everyone is so confident putting this headline that we are the largest? And there's a lot of data available readily on population growth rate and so on. Where does this data come from?
So yeah, we should all be much more honest about the fact that we don't really know, because as you've said, these are all projections now since we haven't had a census since 2011. That 1.4 billion number came from the UN, which also does modeled projections. But what they need to make assumptions around are things like fertility, migration, urbanization, which are all moving in ways that we don't fully understand. So the UN itself produced these estimates in 2022 and then revised them in 24 and had to make small adjustments for all countries, including in India, because fertility, for example, is falling far faster in India than most demographers predicted. It was expected to fall. It's falling very fast.
Where do you think we are now in the per couple fertility rate? Is still 2.2, 2.3?
No, we have passed replacement levels.
Below 2.1.
Replacement is 2.1, we have passed it. And here, this is something...
But population is not declining because people are living longer.
That's right. So currently mortality is going up. It will change over time as we age. Then you know the mortality changes there. But also it takes time to move from stability to decline. But still the projection is 2060. 2060 is not that far off. After which there will be no further population growth. And in some states, the child population started declining in the early 2000s. In absolute numbers, the number of children, the child population started declining.
Let me understand that. So you're saying every year now, lesser number of children are born compared to the year before?
Yes.
And that has been going on for a while?
Yes, since the early 2000s.
So I think we are in some ways the last leg of demographic dividend. We have another 20, 30 years to do the good, bad, whatever we can make out of that.
Yes, I don't think I would use the phrase demographic dividend anymore. In fact, the speed of aging is actually not something that I feel we contend very well with in India. So you will have seen Economist cover stories or FT cover stories on depopulation and aging in South Korea or Japan. Urban Andhra Pradesh, urban West Bengal, and the urban parts of all southern states have fertility rates now in 2021 actually that are comparable with Norway, with Korea, with Japan.
This is what, 1.34?
Yes, well below 2. And West Bengal has had well below 2, urban West Bengal, since for more than 20 years now. But I've never seen an Economist cover story on depopulation in urban West Bengal, for example. So I don't think we are in any way prepared for just how fast aging, and it means multiple things. Of course, it means aging. So I think all of the southern states are not prepared for what aging means. If families are going to have one child, many of whom go overseas to work, what does it mean for social structure? What does it mean for an elderly couple or a single elderly person now living alone, sometimes in cities or in villages? But it changes many things. It also means that the ability to invest in education of that one child, for example, really changes. It means things potentially for the sex ratio. If it is that you're going to have only one child, I think the incentives for families who still have a son preference to make sure that that child is a son then go up. So, these are all, there are intended and unintended consequences. I don't think we've come anywhere close to grappling with any. There's a demographer who says to me, and I think I say it in the book as well, that we have family planning departments in all states in India. He says the southern Indian states should shut the family planning department and they should have departments of aging instead. That is the priority there. Of course, there remain women without access to contraception who do need that, but we are not, our response is not proportionate. And just the fact that there are politicians or others who can still talk about things like population explosion and, create a moral panic about that just shows that nobody's been paying attention to numbers for 20 years now.
And I'll maybe come back to aging, but since you mentioned the sex ratio, what are the latest stats on that? Is India at least doing better? Because I remember 20, 30 years ago, it was massive concern. We are among the, lower spectrum globally. Is it any better now?
It's really changed. So it's changed substantially in the last 10 years in particular. It remains an imbalance, but it does seem to be improving, including in states where it was particularly problematic, including Punjab and Haryana. But I think when sex ratio intersects with falling fertility, then it produces trends that we cannot be very sure what they're going to look like. So one of the things that I find interesting by looking at children within households, which you can do from some of our big surveys, is that big families tend to be families with a lot of girls, because the desire for at least one son is so strong that you're very likely to see an eldest sister, but you're much less likely to see an eldest brother followed by many younger sisters.
Got it. But I guess in some ways, given that we are pretty much hitting some kind of population plateau. My understanding is the annual growth of agreed population is just about a percentage or so.
Yes.
And you are right. I think it will taper off, plateau at I don't know, 1.6, 1.7 billion
Yes.
sometime in
That's
next 20, 30 years, right?
Yeah.
So which means overall the trend of, much smaller family size and overall at country level also, I think we're at 2.2 or so.
Yeah.
2.1 is sustainable level. And as you were saying, in a lot of areas. So I think probably, I don't know whether it's a consequence of economic growth, definitely much better education also, a lot more countries as a whole, I think in last couple of generations, a lot more educated. So probably that bias towards, the boy child has hopefully moved significantly, if not all the way where it needs to be.
I do think that norms have changed, but I think that feeling of at least one son being necessary remains. So that does mean that if a family has had multiple girls, then things change. But overall, because the norm has changed as well as the desire for large families has gone down. And yes, as you say, it is purely an effect of rising incomes and better access to health and education, which is why really anyone creating a moral panic should just settle down, because as countries get richer and women get better access to health and education, fertility goes down. There is nothing anybody needs to do about it.
I think, and throughout your book, what comes across very clearly that most complicated social issues we can understand much better if we pay attention to all the data. And since you mentioned a moral panic a couple of times, what's your understanding? Do a lot of politicians also consume data voraciously or not?
They do. So I do think that they hire people who look at data. The political parties have large teams, and the deployment of data and mining this data for political strategy absolutely happens. I think it happens in several positive ways. So I think the development of schemes as well as targeting of schemes is very much driven by the looking at data. And on some things, I feel very positive that data has changed the conversation. So the fact that we had a discussion around childcare in the most recent budget, for example, means that the government has paid attention to the data that has shown that female labor force participation is very low. It is extremely low compared to other countries, and we're going to have to do something to fix it. And childcare is, one of the ways that it can be done. So insights from data to shift policy is extremely promising. What I get frustrated about is when, and I don't expect all electioneering to happen around data alone. I think even the issues that appeal to me, things like broader concepts, which is the dignity of people or self-respect, issues like that, don't necessarily emerge from data alone. But when something has been apparent in the numbers for years, but is willfully ignored to make political points, then I feel bad. I don't feel bad about people who don't have access to the numbers or are getting it wrong. But when you know that if you put one intern to the job, they can Google UN population numbers and tell you the correct state, but you continue to make these points, it's unforgivable. Then it is an attempt to mislead people for election gain.
The election have their own dynamics, and so I want to go back to again book. There's so many interesting things you have covered. So chapter 5 and 6 are both about, how does India make money and how does India spend money? And I think this is also somewhat related to, the perception of middle class, which also you touch upon in your book. Today, if you look at university in Bangalore, we think probably everybody is investing money through Grow and everyone invests in stock market. But that's in some ways small echo chamber that we don't realize. Bangalore is large, but very small compared to, let's say, all of India. So but just share some insights on what did you learn as you're going through these chapters? How does India make money and how does India spend money?
So how India makes money is actually very poorly understood. And the reason for that is because India does not officially collect data on incomes. And I have great sympathy for surveyors attempting to do this because, if you think of most people's lives in India, they, first of all, involve a lot of jobs, more than one. A lot of this is completely informal. And then if you think about rural areas, it's seasonal as well. And some of it is not payment in cash. It is payment in kind, produce from fields, etc. So that means that asking your average survey respondent to accurately estimate their income is very challenging. And the Indian statistical system's response to it has been to not attempt it at all. So we don't collect income statistics. We know income tax, but we know that that's a
But then how do
very
we talk
small
about X percentage below poverty line and all that?
So all of that comes from our use of consumption expenditure as a proxy for income. We can ask people how much they spend on things. And this too, I found actually understanding how the survey is conducted, really shifted my understanding. There are 300 items. It's a questionnaire that goes from salt to cars. That is administered
hopefully not to same
700,000
person.
people. To the same person.
Each person is going to fill out across those 300 things.
That's right. Just this
How much they
time
get paid for filling that?
Nothing. We are not allowed legally to pay survey respondents. One of the things that the government has done this time is they've split the survey into 3. So there are 3 visits now. In the past, when they use the term survey fatigue, you think of it as a concept. But here I would imagine there is literal physical exhaustion after answering 300 questions. And it's not just quantity. How much did you spend, did you consume in the last this? Also money. How much did you pay for it?
Let's spend a minute on this. I'm trying to visualize that I'm, let's say, someone with a very low income person. Let's say, I don't know, make 8,000 rupees a month. And somebody from the survey organization comes and say, hey, look, we are doing this survey to understand spend patterns. So sit down with me. And here are 300 items. We'll go through it line item by line item. And by the way, you are now going to get paid for this. And that's what rolls up into all the aggregate statistics and trends that we
That is exactly
consume.
what happens.
Wow. How long does the whole process take for one person to?
So it used to take several hours, which is now why it has been split into 3. And the hope is that they'll have better response rate now that they're splitting it into 3.
And is this unique to India that that we don't have income data, we only have consumption data, or is it globally also is like that?
It's a problem for developing countries, particularly those that are more agrarian, because of the seasonality in particular.
And is it partly
there is one organization in India that does attempt to collect it. The National Council for Applied Economic Research conducts this big India Human Development Survey that in fact will come out in December every 5 years or so. They are the only big surveyors to collect income data.
And is it partly because we have, I don't know what, few crore people who file income taxes? So, and that's probably the only source of, where people are voluntarily declaring their income. Hopefully that's right income. But for the rest of the 98% population, there is no mechanism for them to say, this is my income.
That's right. If everybody had to file a return, irrespective of, whether it was taxable or not, then perhaps we would have a better sense of things. But given that the vast majority work in the informal sector, it wouldn't work in that way as well. So what we do is what many other poorer countries do, which is use consumption as a proxy for income.
Right. So what are some of the interesting things that we learned by looking at the consumption?
So let me give you an update on the numbers in the book, because we've had a survey now that came out some months ago. The reason that I could not use updated numbers in the book is because there was a survey done in 17-18, but the numbers were not made public. So at that time, we had older data. And I think this bubble that you speak about, you describe it as Bangalore, but I would say all of us exist in versions of these bubbles where when the budget comes out, people will, tweet, what about the middle class? Or people will sometimes say, I remember eating Maggie after school and I'm so middle class. None of us are middle class. Absolutely nobody listening to this podcast is anywhere near middle class. The most recent consumption expenditure survey shows that if you spend as an individual, but on everything from rent, just leave out EMI and I'll explain, not even, but from rent to everything else. If you spend more than 20,000 rupees in a month, you're in the top 5% of the country. So we are
Just voice repeating. So anybody who's spending more than 20,000 rupees a month, which I assume nearly everyone who's at least employed in Bangalore, they're in top 5 percentile people in the country.
That's right. So this, typically expenditure happens within a household, and this is divided equally. The numbers are divided equally among all individuals. So let's assume that there are 2 children and 2 adults in a household. Let's have a little more generous view. Then it would be a household expenditure of 80,000 rupees, which is a little, more of a generous understanding. But still, it includes everything from school fees to petrol to rent. In 2022-23, we've had a household consumption expenditure survey, which is conducted by the government. It surveys over 100,000 households across the country, representative, etc. And this list of items, and then you put it all together and you come up with an overall number. And what it shows is that in urban India, if you spend more than 30,000 rupees all told on everything, including rent in a month, that puts you in the top 1% of the country. If you spend something like 5,000 rupees or so, that is what the middle class individual. So about 20,000 rupees would put you in the middle of the country for a whole household. Household expenditure of 20,000 rupees.
And let's consider, Bangalore software engineer who probably makes 40 lakhs annually. So probably easily spending, 1.5 lakhs rupees a month is definitely in the decimal percentage point, well above within top 1 percentile.
Absolutely. I think now, some of us, except, we are all definitely in the top 1%. I think we need to move beyond that. We're in the top 0.1% of the country. We're not even in the top 1.
Which also means, a lot of people, probably I'm guessing most of the listeners of this podcast also, is, we interact with people in this, similar income level and so on. And we've maybe grown up speaking as if we are middle class, and we people don't realize that, graduate out of that, and we're kind of maybe even losing touch with who the real middle class is. And as a result, somewhere maybe those folks, don't have enough voice and they get misrepresented because people who, there is no malice here. People just genuinely think, you make 40 lakhs a year and you're middle class.
Absolutely.
But the real middle class is somebody who's probably making 2 lakh a year.
Absolutely. And so all of the things that we say about the middle class, which is, these are people who are taking domestic holidays, not international. These are people who grew up taking trains, will have taken their first flight. All of it does not apply to what genuinely is a middle class. And to me, it's almost, rather than coming up with a better notion of what the middle class, so, by the numbers, it shows 20,000 rupees. So should we now reframe to think? I actually think it's not terribly productive to think of the middle class by the definitions that we've typically borrowed from the West. Like in political science, the middle class is a group that is not precarious anymore. Their necessities are taken care of. So they invest heavily in education of children and they desire stability. Those are some of the, borrowed concepts about the middle class. I don't think any of that applies to what is the actual middle of the country because it is precarious. If 20,000 rupees for your entire family, and when safety nets don't exist, as we know in the pandemic they didn't, I think we should just give up on this borrowed notion of what a middle class is. To me, it seems much more productive to think of the rich and then grades of everyone else who's not rich, or maybe grades of the poor. It's just not productive to think of the middle class in the same way. And this sort of victimhood mentality that sometimes people have, the super rich take care of themselves, the poor have schemes for them. What about the middle class? It's just based in no notion of reality at all.
Yeah. And just continuing with that theme, how does India spend money? Where does most of the expenditure go?
One of the things I do want to stress is what many of these numbers and most Indian statistics, I would broadly say what they show. The snapshot is usually more humbling than our, notions of reality. But it is a story of change. This is a country where things on all counts, or virtually all counts, are consistently improving over time. Access to every amenity has consistently improved over time. So I think it's wrong when people characterize this as, okay, people are much poorer than you thought and everything's getting worse and that's not true either. So I just want to be clear on that count. What's changing, and to me the most dramatic change, and in some ways we can, square this with our conversations with people, is that food is now a much smaller share of people's spending than it was before. And it makes sense. When you're much poorer, most of your money essentially goes on filling, on the mouths in the house. And within food, even cereals used to be the largest share. So in this expenditure survey, we see, for example, that for the first time, food now occupies less than half of the expenditure basket, and non-food things, including spending on education, health, but also fuel, now occupies more than half. And even within food, one of the things I find very interesting is this huge rise in spending on processed foods, including packaged foods, beverages, but also cooked meals outside. So we do see that a lot of people purchase and eat outside, including people who are migrants or people who are working in the day. And we see this big change in the numbers. So in some ways, it's interesting to me that from that, how much do you spend and how much do you buy of salt, they are able to track these big trends that do reflect in what we're seeing in the country too.
And Rukmani, do you there are people who track, important dates or announcement, like, I don't know, when will IPL start or festivals? Do you track when some of these, key reports will come out and eagerly wait for them?
Yes, the National Sample Survey has very kindly put out an advance release calendar, and I plan my entire life around it.
Like, next 12 months, what are some of the reports that are going to come out that you are going to eagerly watch?
The NSS has a couple. The NSS has another round of the expenditure survey that's in the field. I'm very excited about that. There are some slightly delayed reports that need to come out. There's also a survey of unorganized sector that's come out already that we're keen to look at. And then, of course, there's the hope that the census will go into the field sometime. Then the India Human Development Survey, not produced by the government, is expected in December. And it's a really good survey because, among other things, it asks behavioral questions. Things like how much say does a woman in the household have in purchase decisions? And we do see these also improving over time. So it's interesting to see social norms shifting or not shifting as well.
Do you also go through this annual economic survey? Does it help shed some insight into what's happening in the country?
It does. I mean, the point of the economic survey is to aggregate statistics. So it's not a source of new statistics, but it's a great document. I think it also sometimes, it's not just meant to provide policy directions, but sometimes it also shows almost the creative directions of the people in power. Then there are times where there have been more stories or more sort of creative liberties taken there. I think there's a lot of planning around what are some of the interesting directions they're going to take in, and at times there is actual original research work that comes out from it as well. So they are able to sometimes access data that's not available to the rest of us. In the past, there has, for example, been estimates of migration produced by using Indian Railways data, which all of us would give an arm and a leg for, which showed something that we all suspect, which is that official numbers on migration are probably much lower than the real numbers because so many people do short-term or circular migration, which doesn't get captured by official statistics.
And are there events or conference where all the data enthusiasts like you gather and exchange stories, anticipation of reports or lamenting about reports which are not?
To geek out on all of those, yes. So they happen informally, but what I'm very pleased with is that in the last few months, there have been government-organized events of this sort. So one is, there's data.gov.in, which is the government's own repository. And that team in particular is amazingly receptive of what the open data community wants. So, requests for APIs and things like that, extremely receptive to criticism as well when we complain about, data not being frequent enough. And they invite people from industry and others to come and speak at public events. Additionally, the National Sample Organization has had two recent events where they present new surveys, they present the findings from it and invite us, the users, to ask questions. There's often criticism, and then it's also very hands-on. Like there's tips on how to actually reproduce this data and work with it. So if this represents some growing openness and a greater embrace of the open data community, then that will be a very exciting direction.
Got it. And what is the role of non-government organizations in data compilation at scale? Because I assume it's also fairly expensive process and someone needs to fund it. Do we have enough sources of non-governmental data at scale that professionals like you rely on?
We don't. So the survey that I mentioned is really the only publicly available large sample survey. The other one is CMI, but that is, of course, a paid product, as it should be. It doesn't need to be, not everybody needs to be creating.
CMI is what?
The Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy that does a massive large-scale panel survey where they go back to the same households. And that data has been invaluable for not just firms who want to take decisions about where to position selling bikes, for example, but also the research community that now relies on this heavily to produce work, especially around employment trends from there. So CMI has been a great addition to the ecosystem, but it's not publicly available data. My sort of maybe complaint is around the big tech community, where I do feel, see, I am under no misconceptions here. We have willingly handed over our data to Google, Facebook, Meta, and they are under no legal obligation to be providing us insights from it. But I do think that there is a case that it can be made for anonymized data that is in the public good to be shared more often with the research and analytic community. Now, Google did this during the pandemic, for example, when they made Google mobility data widely available. And district collectors were able to use it, for example, to see that there had been a religious gathering in one area, and then one could expect an outbreak there, and then to plan for more beds, for example. I think there needs to be some sort of compact where these where we are able to come together to agree on some essential parts of the data that with protections should be made available to the community. And they do occasionally my bigger complaint is they do occasionally make it available. Either they make it available to select researchers and then it doesn't become a public good, or they make it available as PR. This shows that biryani was the top order dish. I enjoy reading that too, but I wish there was more granular and more sort of public spirited information more widely available.
I think that's a very important point. And now that you say it, there is absolutely, first of all, no question that Google and Meta have probably incredible amount of data about what's happening in the country on an everyday basis. And of course, they need to respect consumers' privacy, and no one, as you are obviously not asking for them to violate, but at an aggregate level, anonymized level, so many insights can come out. It'll be great PR for them. It'll be great public good. I know that a lot of folks from Google and Meta watch this podcast, so probably they can,
But what I want to
take this up with their managers and the India heads. And just ask this. They absolutely should be doing. I just don't see any. This is a win-win for everybody involved.
But what I want to argue is that it's not always going to be good PR, right? Like we might find, for example, what one would love to see from dating website data, for example, is that one senses outside is that there isn't a lot of intercaste mixing. Perhaps that is similar. So it's not always going to be happy stories. And I think part of maturity is to accept if the government of India is making data available that they know shows, for example, what the top 1% of the country really looks like. There is a level of maturity that's needed to make this anonymized information available, even if it isn't telling you happy stories alone.
No, I think you're making a very important point, and I hope somebody listening to this takes it seriously. See, one is you're right that we have willingly handed over to Google and Meta. They are great organizations, and it's not like they are stealing. We invited them. China created all this protection mechanism. We chose not to. Fine, that's past. But we can co-opt a lot of this information. Data is enabler for a lot of things. It's important for policymakers, for businesses, for developmental policies, and so on.
Right.
A deep insight about where is country going at a granular level, because sometimes macro picture, a lot of the nuances gets lost.
Right.
So I think this is probably something should be a priority. It's some kind of partnership between government, this big tech organization, and people who are vested in data as an enabler for the country's development. This is, at some level, it is absolutely no-brainer. And I wish there's some more movement in the direction. That's my small pitch on this topic.
And we do see a couple of good examples. So there's the Google mobility data. There's also something called the Facebook Wealth Index that they produced some time ago, which again researchers use as proxy for, because we don't know what district wealth is, for example, in India. They have used it in research. So if these organizations are invested in greater scholarship on India coming out, then really making some of this available, and not available to select Ivy League researchers only, but even to, us.
I'll definitely love to, have both Sanjay from Google and Sandhya from Meta be on this podcast and bring this up also if they agree to be here. But just going back to, the book again, and actually, and maybe actually this is probably not covered in the book. there's one more survey which I don't know who conducts it. I think it's called IRSA, about education.
Yes.
And that's a lot of people sorry?
ASER, ASER.
ASER, sorry, got my idea. So that, from people who work in education, that has not been portraying very rosy picture for a while now. Any insights around that?
Yeah. So it's really a remarkable survey, and it's in some ways a huge success story of shifting the needle on policy by a survey done by a non-governmental organization, and not, a hugely funded big organization. It's Pratham, and it's really quite admirable. So the story on education in India broadly is huge success on enrollment, elementary enrollment, universal now. Huge success on literacy. Literacy is really not an indicator worth looking at anymore, because it's only differentiated by age. Among younger people, there's 100% literacy. Huge improvements on closing the gender gaps. The gender gap in elementary education closed now.
Yeah.
But quality of education, massive issue.
Right.
So you're getting children into school, but they're not learning a lot. This is happening in government schools, it's happening in private schools as well. This is happening both in terms of languages as well as math, and it's not an English issue because this survey is conducted in local languages. So what the Pratham surveyors for Asar do is that they ask the child to either read a simple line written in their language and solve simple math sums. They've put a lot of effort into making sure that these are age appropriate, in fact lower than what should be expected at that age, and extremely low, very worrying levels of achievement on that. This is also an area where government data is lacking. It's not just lacking because of lack of availability. It's also lacking because the one government survey that does exist, which is called the National Achievement Survey, is a very poor survey. And government will agree as well. The government knows how to do very good surveys. The National Achievement Survey is not a good one. I think giving teachers in school or schools the job of accurately estimating whether kids are learning in school is never going to produce, very unbiased outcomes. So I do think that the reason we are all talking about quality of education is because of the Asar survey alone. So in that way, it is a huge success in bringing in quality into the education discussion in a way that hasn't happened before. I'm sure they too find it depressing that it continues year after year. You see similar issues. But it also, I think, partly encourages, but also for their own reasons. State governments have attempted many remedial things. So they've attempted working with para teachers. They've attempted extra classes after school and seen if that helps. Tamil Nadu, for example, ran a pandemic scheme where they took extra lessons. And then there was a study done by Karthik Muralidharan, in fact, which showed that it was able to, bridge the gap, those extra hours that they put in. So, yes, absolutely. The big worry about education is this. You're getting kids into school, but what are they learning?
And what about, and you mentioned aging before, health and aging. Do we have regular quality data available? And if so, what does it tell us? Where is country headed?
So we didn't until now, because the National Family Health Survey was singularly focused on reproductive health. So the age cutoff was 49 and 54, and we had very poor information about aging at all. But again, the government has started something called the Longitudinal Aging Survey of India, which is meant to, and it's quite admirable, the range of questions, because they include things like, elder abuse, mental health, those questions are included as well. The data is quite hard to use currently, but they're continuing, they're doing multiple rounds in the field. So one does hope that maybe in a few months or next year, there should be enough good data that we'll have a better insight into aging. I really think it's been a neglected area in India. It hasn't seemed like a large enough concern. But again, particularly the southern states, they really should be putting money, not just relying on Government of India surveys. They should be putting money into better understanding and then working on aging.
Yeah, from what I understand, I think in the coming decades, and in some ways, some of the Western countries are already seeing it. And definitely these states will see a situation where there are a lot more older people who are living, longer, probably by themselves, as kids have moved on, and we just don't have that, concept. In the past, first of all, people were not living very long, and if you are in a joint family setup, there are people around you.
Yeah.
But this is like very unique problem at scale that is coming at us very fast.
That's right. And I think for the segment that can pay, industry has responded. So Pune, where I'm from, for example, one of the absolutely transformative things of the last 10 years has been the growth of this elder care and elder care
These
community.
age tech companies.
Yes, and a whole range of them, and really providing not just essential facilities, but a sense of community that there is an acceptance that, especially with children living overseas, that's not going to come in any other way. So I think for people who can pay, and industry is absolutely recognizing it. If you drive through Coimbatore, all you see on both sides are large hoardings for other elder care facilities. But for people who can't pay, and especially from welfare state perspective, it also means that your working age population, the population who can pay for benefits for older people, is shrinking. So what does that mean for taxation? What does that mean for a welfare state? It has economic implications as well.
So Rukmani, sounds like you're a big fan of, or at least you are quite confident the quality of data that comes from the government organization is probably based a lot of insight and the book on the findings from that. But recently you started this new organization, Data for India. So what is the gap you see and what that you're trying to address through this organization?
So I feel that access to data, particularly for people like me, has improved a lot in the last 10 years compared to what it was like getting data 10 years ago. I feel like it's now, most of it is available online, even right down to the unit level, and we're able to have discussions with people in government around it. But I do feel, and I think this was a sense that was really strengthened when I started traveling after the book, is that the public understanding that should come as a result of this data has not happened. Perhaps we thought that it was the job of the news media to build this public understanding. And if so, I've had to confront the fact that incentives are not aligned there. The incentives of the news media to build long-lasting, durable public goods are not there. So many of the things that I felt, why am I writing this now? Why am I repeating it? It did come as a result of the fact that this understanding of those issues had not yet happened. And this is a gap that I feel that needs to be bridged. It's unfair. We often say we might mock people who have views that are, wrong or incorrect or inaccurate, or we might mock people who believe things on WhatsApp. But if they don't have access to that information, then one can't blame them for that. And I don't think that creating data portals alone is a good enough solution, because I do think that people need to be handheld through that information. But doing that is requires a measure of responsibility, that you are not cherry picking and you're not being partisan in the handholding through the data. So the idea of Data for India is that it is a public platform that aims to expand and enhance this public understanding of key socio-economic issues in India through the data. But we lead in by simple writing. We don't expect people to come in with a level of ability to work through the numbers. I think just as I work through numbers as a layperson without a background in numbers, those are the people I'm writing for. And we are not writing for people necessarily in research or policy spaces. Our sense is that if two friends are arguing in a bar and one says, no, population is going to grow till 2100, and the other one says, no, it's already declining, they shouldn't have to go to Wikipedia to sort this out. We want them to be able to come here and answer questions that they have in their own mind about socioeconomic issues in India by reading a well-told piece about the state of information here. And we really rely very strongly on not cherry picking the data and on not being partisan. If we are, then we will lose credibility and interest very quickly, because I think there's too much of that out there anyway. We also try to use multiple data sources so that we're not, based on a single source. And what we're very, very keen on is making that source of data, making the methodology very easy to understand. So it's not a trust me, bro. It is trust what we're saying because this is the data. Go back and look at the data yourself too if you want. So there's the writing. There are charts that we want people to have fun with. It shouldn't seem like a chore that, you're having to look up this information. Have fun with the data, with the charts, share them, use them. And the background data is there as well. So if you want to really geek out and you want to see the numbers yourself, go check them and make sure that we are not cherry picking.
Trust but verify is always the best policy.
Yes, and don't take anybody's word as the ultimate truth. We would want you to take our word, but only because we built that trust by you looking at the data yourself. So we look at 5 or 6 key verticals right now, including health, population, economy, employment. and living conditions. And we have a vertical called measurement that sounds really nerdy, but that I really encourage people to read, because the idea is to, in very simple terms, tell people what these indicators mean and exactly how the numbers are collected. So just as we talked about going from salt to cars, we try to do that with all of the numbers, because you would have to understand how they're collected. If I had presented these household consumption numbers to you, without telling you how they were collected, you might have thought, how does anybody know how much they spend in a month? They're getting, but once you know that this is the exact system, it's not just to understand it better. The only path to credibility in those numbers is if there's full transparency in that as well.
And what are some of the recent stories that you covered at Data for India that may be good teaser for people to get interested and check out, detailed stories on the site?
So, the numbers that I mentioned to you earlier about household spending are there in detail, including state-wise, including what the top 1% versus the bottom 20%, including change over time, which I feel is very, important to show. So that's one recent one. Another one that we have is about access to electricity, which I find fascinating. First of all, it's one of those amazing stories of really going exponential growth. We were at 60% people with access to electricity in 2000, not that long ago at all, to near 100% now. But what we are also able to look at is how much electricity do people consume. So you may have access to electricity, but if all you're able to do is power 2 bulbs in a day versus me running 2 ACs a day, that too is something you should know. So that's something we have up as well.
Okay. The most of the details people can find on the website. So Rukmini, for our listeners who have probably stayed with us till this one, we're nearly at the end. They must be like bona fide data geeks. So for them specifically, what are some of the resources and reports and surveys and maybe some dates they should mark on their calendar of that? Like, what are some of the pointers that people who have deep interest in this to dig deeper?
So I think the government itself has made some great advances, which I want to point to. So there is something called the National Data Analytics Platform, NDAP, which is a fun portal to use. You can visualize, you can make maps, and you can look at key data over there. I'm of course going to shill for dataforindia.com that I would want people to look at. Another exciting resource is one called the Development Data Lab, DDL, which is meant to be, again, an open source resource for researchers producing data on India for it to come together. Then a Bangalore origin Google group that I want to give a shout out to is called Data Meet. It is a community of open data users, and we are now in our 10th or 15th year. A great community of just open data enthusiasts. In terms of dates, I think December is going to be exciting I feel so embarrassed to even say exciting, but now we're too far gone anyway. When the India Human Development Survey comes out, that's my secret shame. A date that I don't have that will be exciting is when the census goes into the field.
Hopefully very soon. Rukmini, I want to thank you for, first of all, the work you are doing. We are a country of, people with a lot of opinions, but data is a good counter to, unfounded opinion, and sometimes, understanding things in all its nuances. So I think all the work you've done here, from being an early pioneer and first of all making data journalism a big part of how mainstream media functions today. Your book is outstanding. I think you have a great knack for telling very colorful stories, but leveraging sound, credible data as a backdrop, and you're continuing that work with Data for India. Really thankful for you taking the time and helping us just understanding this whole field of data and hopefully inspiring some data geeks, for future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I feel like it was a one-hour geek fest, and can't think of a better way to spend
All right, you recruit one more person to your data geek community.
Yeah, to my cult.
All right. No, cult is something I want.
I know. I use that very thoughtfully.
All right, Rukmini, thank you.
Thanks.
At Sparks, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to Sparks on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.